Good morning and welcome to the new edition of Dr.Lamba's Awakening. I've been reading a lot and we have been talking a lot about the Western view of present day India, the Western media, the self anointed Indian intellectuals, and some people who are really concerned with human rights, but they live in ivory towers cut off from the realities of life, for whom the textbook meanings are much more important than the realistic situations. And some judges who want to show themselves as paragons of virtue have been crying hoarse about India becoming a nation where freedom of speech is muffled. Is it true? Let me start with a caveat. I have always been a very vocal critic of the earlier incarnation of BJP, that was Johnson, and I hated with almost a pathological hate. BJP changed my view to some extent, but then I saw the way the opposition to the even honest work of BJP and RSS was derided, thrown in, and projected in the wrong light. I thought we should give them a chance. And when Modi came into being, his work and my first meeting with him way back in 2003 impressed me. Coming back to this freedom erosion in India, the well-known journalist of Indian origin, Farid Zakaria, story on how freedom is eroding in India, is doing rounds nowadays on the social media. His show, GPS, is a very well watched show, very keenly watched. And he quotes the latest Freedom House ranking of India's downfall as far as human rights are concerned, as far as the freedom of speech is concerned, and he quotes an Indian historian, Ram Guha, who is evidently leftist, and whenever you read Ramgua, you find that he has a purpose. Now, given Zakaria's background and his credentials, his statements do not come as a surprise. It is exactly like Tavleen Singh, one Indian journalist, was all praise and she would go gaga about Modi and his work. But the moment her son's visa was cancelled, because his father happened to be a Muslim politician. Tavleen had married the Sikh, former governor of Punjab. So his son was not entitled for a OCI pass, so that was cancelled. And since that day, she is now deadly writing vitriolic, poisonous articles. And if that is suppressed, then they call it a freedom of speech because this freedom is being misused. So anyway, Ram Koha is a part of that opposition. And these critics of India's suppression of freedom, at least the alleged ones, are out of power politicians, pseudo liberals, self aggrandizing intellectuals, and parts of media that definitely, deliberately refuse to recognize that Modi has a two-time elected prime minister. So the majority of the people like him. And if it was really so that the freedom was being muffled, he would have been thrown the dunghill in 2019. You remember Indira Gandhi had imposed emergency. And immediately after that, elections took place and she was thrown out. So people had no special love for Modi. As a matter of fact, Indira was much more loved. Now, this article was prompted by recent implementation of the government rules related to social media. And they said there is no sound reason why social media should be controlled. They forgot that social media is responsible to a large extent for spread of hatred and misinformation. Now, what is freedom of right? According to the Oxford Dictionary, the right to express an opinion without censorship or restraint, retaliation, or legal sanction. But the say exceptions have been listed as obscenity, fraud, child pornography, speech integral to the illegal conduct, and lawlessness, danger to national security, copyright, intellectual rights, and harm to the others. So, if within these parameters some restrictions are placed, and those restrictions do not impinge on your right to speak, then what's wrong with that? And secondly, every right has an equal and reciprocal responsibility. So, if you have a freedom to speak, that doesn't mean you can insult others or create illness. When you say that India would be divided, when you say that a terrorist who was hanged should not have been hanged, and rather you feel regret that the people who hanged them, including the judiciary, are still alive, they should have been killed. That's not freedom of speech. So, problem with the exceptions is who will decide the application of these exceptions? Naturally, the government. The freedom of speech is recognized by Universal Declaration of Human Rights, an international covenant on civil and political rights. And the first formal Freedom of Press Act was introduced in Sweden in 1766. French Revolution in 1789 emphasized the rights of man and citizen and said freedom of speech is fundamental to humans in any democratic setup. Absolutely correct. And then coming to India's culture back, no, you cannot impose a restriction which goes against the culture of the country. Let's be very clear about that. The moment you do it, you're doomed. This happened, as I said, way back when Indira Gandhi wanted to impose restriction, and she was thrown in the garbage. But then they saw that the opposition came into power, was a ragtag opposition, they couldn't do anything. So she came back. Now, culturally, India has been an outstanding example of freedom of speech, freedom of religion, since ancient times. It was the first country in the world to give refuge to Zoroastrians, to Jews, and the first Muslim masjid, mosque, was built outside Arabia in India. Can you believe it? Even in the time when Muhammad was living, they had built a mosque in India. So it was free movement. Any thought, expressions, even anti-God views are a part of everyday life. There's no restriction on speech, writing, and everything. And that happened in the past. But by the way, are you aware that many thinkers who opposed Vedas and even called authors of Vedas hypocrites? They were regarded not as heretics but as sages. Buddha, Mahavira opposed Vedas and their teaching. And the people were allowed to walk and preach naked as Naga sadhus, Digambar Jain Munis. So freedom was to that extent. Public debate was common on any subject. And if somebody was could can say that the cultural background of India does not exist today, would be mistaken. Now, compared to USA, burning and desecration, the national flags are covered by the freedom of expression of freedom. You can burn a flag, so it's okay. In Sweden, pornography is permissible. That's freedom of speech. I'm not supporting such actions and would strongly recommend self-restraint without competence. But if the self-restraint is not there, then the government has to do it. MISA, enacted by Mrs. Gandhi, was the most draconian measure ever adopted to crush the freedom of speech. But she also had to remove it. The recent government actions have resulted in a bad name only because of the people being misled by this group of pseudo intellectuals anti-India group and anti-allergic group. Now, frankly, there's a strong case to see that in the last 7 years, freedom of speech has been its zenith since independence. You remember Sheikh Abdullah was imprisoned because he talked of Kashmir independence. And today, in GNU, they are talking of not only Kashmir independence, but various states. They say Bharat ke tukde hoge, India would be divided into pieces. Nobody arrests them. And Pandit Nehru, the doyen of the freedom and democracy, arrested Sheikh Abdullah, set him behind bars without any due process of law. So, how is it India different today? We have seen an extensive base, irrational personalities, centered criticism. It's absolutely personal. It's not logical. It's not reasonable. On the volume of anti-India ranting by media and opposition, BJP haters should have ensured that he is defeated in 2019 or in elections in 2024. No, if he can be defeated, his party can be defeated in Bangladesh, in Kerala. Why can't it be defeated at the national level? It can be. Now, come to that. Prior to the BJP coming to power in 2014, some influential media personalities, liberals, intellectuals, today who are part of the opposition, were indirectly running and influencing the past governments on the outside. When BJP came into power, Modi came into power, these personalities, whether they were media, liberals, who had a lot of say, have been sidelined. So they have suffered and they have got to criticize the government because their influence has gone, their source of financial health has gone, they're out of work. Their immense power is no longer there. So they are prompted to spread the falsehoods of erosion of freedom. Secondly, the government has accepted anti-Modi rhetoric as part of freedom, but it has not been so magnanimous when national interests are at stake. And if some upstarts in politics or social media propaganda breaks up the nation on remote communal hatred, should they not be taken to task? Is the freedom curtailed to safeguard the national interest when, as a matter of fact, government has been very lenient. When Rahul Gandhi made statements at the time of Chinese India conflict last year, he should have been arrested and prosecuted. It was not done so. When just now Digvijay said that they'll go back on 370 and create a separate state which can lead to the country. It was not done so. When a Congress leader goes to Pakistan and says, Pakistan, please help us remove Modi, he should have been immediately imprisoned for treason. It has not been done so. Now, what has happened is that nationalism is not taboo in today's world. It's a good word today in India. It was not a good word at one time. In the last 7 years, a lot of people have found a voice, then they are not hesitant to speak for their nation or for the country. Who's speaking against this? This is a fundamental change in India, and it can happen in any society. That the people become more nationalistic. So, what's wrong with that? As a matter of fact, this shows the growth of the people from the tribalism and the state level to the national level. The opposition deliberately presents the government as pro-Hindu. Now, let me tell you very frankly, I also find a lot of lumpen elements in BJP. Some chief ministers are absolutely idiots like that. Chief Minister of Assam was there, and the Chief Minister of Uttarakhand. They have an agenda which is absolutely idiotic. But does it impact the nation? No. As a matter of fact, the concept of sabka saath, sabka vikas, with everybody and everybody's development, has shown. For example, there was a scheme to help people free, I mean, say, delivery of the gas cylinders. Did the government say that the Muslims would not get it or Sikhs would not get it? No. And a lot of noise is created if one Muslim is killed, which is bad. But then if 20 Hindus are killed, now nobody says that it's communal and it should not have happened. This is why there's a pin drop silence at that time. A Muslim girl is raped and huge noise is created. Raping of any girl is an abominable and hateful thing. It should not happen. But why bring religion or race at the times of such human disasters? Opposition makes a beeline to visit the Muslim victims' house to flood their families, and the Congress is doing it. What was this Congress doing in 1984 when the Sikhs were being targeted, picked up, killed, burnt alive? Nothing happened. The zeal and the zest is missing for the national needs. And if some BJP cadres and the supporters raise their voice against this, immediately they said, this is majoritarianism. This is not accepted. For decades, we have not heard that in a democratic society, the majority has to prevail. And for decades, the majority did not prevail. Some states' voices are heard today. And that doesn't go well with the opposition. It is termed as Hindu fundamentalism. Now, fundamentalism, whether it's Hindu or Muslim or Sikh, is absolutely abhorrent. But why is there cry only against the Hindu fundamentalism? Why, when the national flag was hoisted, replaced by Sikh flag at Red Fort, these politicians did not condemn that. They kept quiet. And when you keep quiet, you are in fact consenting to that. Freedom had eroded at that time when 80% Indians had no voice. If today a part of that 80% have been able to find a voice, that means that freedom has strengthened. Now, what used to happen? Government freebies used to be controlled and divided and distributed without middlemen. Now, all those middlemen have to oppose the government. RTRs in mandis, they are opposing our farm bills. And not only that, as a matter of fact, siphoning of the government resources with impunity was an accepted thing in the past. And even Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi admitted that out of every rupee spent, only 13% goes to the real deserving person. 87% is gobbled up by the middleman. And then who has got it? Corruption at the highest level has rooted out. Have you heard any major scam in this period? There were scams galore in UPA government of Manmohan Singh. And Manmohan had a great integrity personally, but he was incapable because he was his master's voice. Then Indian term the integration of Jammu and Kashmir as anti-national. Was this correction not overdue? And then what about NGOs and others who are opposed to and crying hoarse? They were getting aid, grants, and foreign money, which was rampant. And now it's history. Dubious funding from abroad for anti-national activities. Even the farmers' agitation is being sustained by all the funds from Canada and England. Can that be permitted? It's a Hawala system, which is economically very harmful for the country. And when you oppose it, then you say that freedom of expression. Was it not freedom of expression when critics of all hues and colors were given all the freedom to speak against the government when Article 370 was abrogated? Article 335A was abrogated. Did government object to any criticism? There were protests galore. Then CAA was passed and Shaheen Bagh and other protests took place. Did the government take any action? And the farmers' movement for the last more than 6 months is continuing. The citizens are more free today to protest if it had happened. You remember that there was Sadhu's protest in Delhi, and Mrs. Gandhi ordered that it must not take place. More than 100 sadhus were shot dead. Has it happened since then in this government in the last 7 years? People enjoy more full democratic rights than they've ever enjoyed. Then, as I talked of citizen CAA rules, the Citizen Amendment Act, even children were called to raise anti-government slogans. Threats was issued against elected leaders, but they were not prosecuted. Some people were arrested. And it goes to the credit that the government did not exhibit any high-handedness or excessive force. And yet to charge that the freedom of expression is eroding is bizarre, to say the least. Diplomatically, if the government was anti-Muslim, Dubai gives land for building the first temple UAE. The Prime Minister is given the highest civilian honor by Saudi Arabia and by UAE. His personal equation with the Taoist leader actually is causing jealousy. And by jealousy, they can't think of anything else except to create an aura where he is held up in a bad light. These Islamic nations, the Middle East, always used to cheer Pakistan, and now they support India. This by itself shows that all this talk of victimization of Muslims and suppression of freedom of expression are just made up stories. Now, imagine the biggest problem is that India, Modi rather, has a very humble origin. He doesn't belong to dynasty, and he's not privileged. So that cannot be tolerated by the upper classes. If India was indeed foundering on freedom index, then Indian leadership would not have got that goodwill which is getting across the globe. And even the pandemic has been not spared by those who blame the government for freedom as erosion. The need was to stand with the government and augment its effort. First, they started calling Covaxin a BJP vaccine. Can you imagine the stupidity when Digvijay and Rahul Gandhi and other people called a vaccine prepared to prevent COVID BJP vaccine, and they went out to promote vaccine hesitancy. They played politics on the issue, and instead of setting their own house in order, they invariably blame the center. Was the opposition not expanding the freedom to do so? But there was no restriction. Then the freedom of media. Look at any media. 90% of the press is anti-Modi. 35% of the TVs are blatantly anti-Modi. But they enjoy more freedom, and yet they say, I'm amazed. I was listening to Ravish Kumar of NDTV. Blatantly wrong, as is NDTV's writings. And yet, those are the people who say that the freedom of expression is crushed. All private media houses continue to hear not only their point of view, but those of opposition with impunity. And there is no objection. Let's be clear. Freedom is a right, but not an absolute right. And Article 419 of the Constitution, as the Supreme Court and the Bombay High Court ruled in September last year, it provides clearly that's not absolute right. Nobody has a right in freedom of any kind which hurts others. As I normally say, if you're walking on the road, you have a freedom to move your arms. But if your arm moves so much that it punches my nose, that's not a freedom. That's an attack on me. So if the national interests are compromised by this freedom, then it has got to be supported. Let's be clear again. No government can always be correct, and so is the Modi government. It has been committing errors. As a corollary, it's also true that no government can always be wrong. There'll always be people who are opposed to the government in power. That's an inherent part of a democratic setup. And the opposition must honor this freedom of choice. They have full freedom to ensure that Modi is thrown out in 2024 if the people are with him. But if they cannot convince the majority of the people, then they have no right to create a bogey of erosion and bring a nation into disrepute. And then doing what? With interested journalists who have their own access to crime, with the NGOs whose livelihood and exploitation of the Indian situation has been put a stop. The opposition has the right to support or oppose the government, but they do not have a right to create and end such a situation that the government ultimately has to act. Till now, the government hasn't acted. They are using their freedom, misusing rather, the freedom of expression in a wrong manner. Constitution gives them the power, but the so-called media, the so-called intellectuals, what they call it, without considering the facts as I was stating, then it's a shocking state of affairs. But by no stretch of imagination can you think that there has been any erosion of the freedom of expression. I have seen from my personal life and with my experience with the government and with the society for the last more than 60 years, I can assure you, you have more freedom today in this government than you ever had. Some incidents will always happen. That's a part of living. But you simply cannot say that in India is on a road to authoritarianism or dictatorship. Thank you.